Welcome to the Good Food CFO podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Delavan, and I'm joined once again by our producer, Chelsea Steer.
Hey, Sarah. Do you want to kick things off today by reading a review?
I would love that.
Okay, well, this Apple Podcast review comes from Sitting by the Fireplace.
Well, that sounds lovely.
Yeah, I don't know if that's their name or what they were doing when they left this review, but we
Either
love it
way,
nonetheless.
yeah.
So they said, keep it up. Sarah's experience combined with her no nonsense analytical mind makes her a great CFO to guide and instruct. I'm enjoying these conversations with thoughtful leaders and episodes with guiding insights from Sarah herself. They open ideas and space to encourage creativity among growing food entrepreneurs.
Well, that's really nice. That's such a lovely review. Thank you, person sitting by the fireplace. And so that's so lovely.
Yeah, it's nice to know, right, that the content that we're making is serving a purpose for people.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, reviews are a great way to help us reach more founders with this podcast. And like I just said, to let us know how we're doing. Do you
Yeah.
like what we're doing? Sometimes we're in a vacuum and we don't really know how it's landing. So it's a great way for us to kind of stay in touch with the content that you guys want.
Yeah.
So if you leave a review, we'll read it here on the podcast as a thank you. So make sure if you do that you include your business name or some sort of identifier to get highlighted here.
Yeah. We'll shout you out for sure. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, Sarah. So we don't have a news segment today because really, as we kind of teased last week, this whole episode is a news segment.
Yeah, in a way, for sure. So last week we talked, as you said, in the news segment about Foxtrot a little bit. We provided some resources and some links for founders who were affected by their very sudden closure just a few weeks ago. And as we mentioned then, we want to know more and we wanted to take a deeper dive into the business because we wanted to gain as much of an understanding about, I think, the timeline and the growth of the company, and then ultimately the closure of the business, not just for the sake of knowing, but to really see what we could learn from it and how we can, understand some of the decisions they made and sort of do better or do differently, right, as founders in the future.
Yeah, exactly. Because, like they say, if you don't know your history, you're doomed to repeat it,
Yeah.
right? So, one thing we do want to point out is that in doing our research for this episode, we scoured the internet for information. Anything we could find on Foxtrot's beginning, their like rounds of funding,
Mhm.
anything that could like fill the gaps of the information that we didn't know.
Yeah, and
And
I'll
oh, go
say,
ahead.
Chelsea, that like there were definitely gaps, right? Like we would read an article and we would get some funding information. Another article would have other funding information. There was definitely a point where we were kind of piecing things together based on dates that were provided and total amounts of funding. And, so we really did our best to gather as much information as we possibly could to put the story together in a chronological order.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there were even articles that we found where they had sort of anonymous, right,
Hmm.
quotes from reportedly from employees inside the company.
Yeah.
And that filled in some gaps for us where we were like, oh, that's what was going on. Yeah,
Hmm.
you're going to hear us reference articles throughout the episode. I don't think we called any of them out by name specifically.
Yeah.
We were like just in the conversation. And so we do want to make sure that you know that all of those links to those articles and sources are going to be included in our show notes if you want to do a deeper dive yourself.
Yeah. And I'll specify that we have referenced in the show notes all of the articles we quote in
Yes.
the episode. We are not providing the exhaustive list of every article we read. We didn't take note of all of those links. We took note of the ones that we included in our conversation
Yeah.
and quoted specifically from in the research. So just want to be really clear about, the work that we did behind the scenes and what we're providing to you guys. And again, this is not a critique of how Foxtrot ran their business, it is a learning. And we wanted to just kind of take the time to examine what happened and share our thoughts and what we thought we could learn from it and share with all of you. And we love communication with our community. So if you have thoughts, if you have additional information, questions that you want to share, reach out to us. Hello at thegoodfoodcfo.com. We love to hear from you. You can respond to our weekly newsletters. That happens,
Yeah.
quite often, or you can just start a fresh email and let us know what you're thinking. I'm also curious to know if you guys like this format of episode. It's really a case study, right?
Yeah.
And it's a case study of what would be considered a small business. And as we know, traditional business media doesn't do that a lot. So if you get to the end of this episode and you like it, let us know that too. Let us know if you like this kind of episode, and maybe there's another business that you would like for us to dig into and kind of do the same style episode on. We want to hear from you. So let us know if that's the case.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Are you ready to get into it, Sarah?
Yeah, let's do it.
As a good food founder, do you ever feel like your work is done in a silo? Is it difficult to feel confident in your business and financial decisions because you don't have a sounding board? Well, in our weekly CFO office hours, you'll not only get the chance to work shoulder to shoulder with the Good Food CFO herself, Sarah Delavan, but also with a small group of your peers. Together, you can support each other through the work of building a business on your own terms. Passes are available now on our website. Just visit thegoodfoodcfo.com and click on services. And now back to the show.
So, Chelsea, today we're doing a deep dive into Foxtrot. And before we really get into it, I want to talk about why we felt like this was a really important episode to do, and why we're taking a full episode to talk about this.
Yeah.
First of all, I want to say Foxtrot was a highly funded, fast growing, highly valued business that closed its doors, not seemingly, but literally overnight. That is something that needs attention, right?
Yeah.
These things that are so celebrated in the industry, so celebrated in media, and have such a bad turnout for employees, for suppliers, right? We need to talk about this, and not just the fallout of those things, which are very important to talk about. And those are being talked about, and we need to pay attention to that, but also what went on inside, right? And history is meant to be learned from. And that's the approach we're taking here, right? What can we learn from this story so that history won't repeat itself?
Yeah.
So in this episode, we're going to do a couple of things. We're going to walk through the timeline of Foxtrot from launch through funding and growth to the point of closure and bankruptcy. And along the way, and then at the end, we're going to highlight some what we're calling points of interest, right? Where founders and CFOs can learn from decisions made by Foxtrot. Now, my typical strategy is not grow big, grow fast, take on a ton of funding, right? That's not it. But despite that, there are still things we can learn from this, and lessons that we've learned from other founders and folks on this podcast that can be reinforced through this story.
Absolutely. So, Sarah, the story starts in 2015, right? This is when Foxtrot was founded by their CEO, Mike Lavatola.
Yeah, they founded this while in grad school.
Yes.
Him and Taylor Bloom. It was a project for the University of Chicago's, I believe, New Venture Challenge. So this is something that is put on, I think, annually. That's how Foxtrot started, as a delivery business.
Yeah, they got funding from the school to kind of move this project forward. And they started as a delivery business where they were delivering typically the kinds of products that you would get at a convenience store, right? So ice cream, sodas, maybe like a frozen pizza, wine, beer, like all those kinds of things.
But the high quality version of those.
Yeah, exactly. The high quality versions. And one of the early, I don't want to call it roadblocks, but like kind of things that changed the way they looked at the business was that in Illinois, they had some issue with the law around delivering liquor and beer, alcohol, right? So they did decide to open one small retail location in Chicago in order to basically get around that.
Yeah. And I don't think they realize, based on what we've read and researched in putting this episode together, I don't think that they realized that the location was going to take off. I think one of the articles actually said that. Like, they didn't realize it.
Yeah.
But it did.
Yeah. And so then they started adding a lot of new products and different products right to their shelves. And that included prepared foods, different kinds of quick meals. And this is when they really started partnering with local brands. A couple that were referenced are Bang Bang Pie and Biscuits and Aya Pastries.
And so the business stays relatively small for a number of years. So just to reiterate, they launch in 2015. And they started off with relatively slow growth, not no growth, but comparatively to what we're about to kind of see and hear and talk through. By 2020, Foxtrot had 7 locations in Chicago and had, moved into a new market of Dallas, Texas, and they had 2 locations there with more stores and millions of dollars of new investment on the way. So this is where I think we should kind of go to the story of, what we understand to be 8 to 9 rounds of funding that Foxtrot went through. I think it's important to talk through when that funding happened, what type of funding it was, how much money, they generated in investment, all to see, I should say, how it funded the growth. And it'll also give us an opportunity to talk about, what did they spend that money on?
Yeah.
What did they invest it in?
Absolutely. And so I want to start us off here in 2020 where you're talking about, right?
Okay.
With these 9 locations. Now, prior to 2020, they had already had 2 seed rounds and 3 early stage rounds.
Okay.
And we weren't able to find out exactly, we weren't able to find the information of exactly how much money they had raised at that point, but we know it was around at least $10 million. Then in 2020, they had their first Series B raise where they raised $17 million. Then, Sarah, in 2021, they had another Series B round where they announced that they raised $42 million. So we're starting to rack up at this point, right? But then in January 2022, this is when they had their Series C round of funding, and they raised $100 million.
I think this is a good point to say. At this time, right, they have 16 locations. So from 2020 to 2022, they've grown from 9 locations to 16 locations. So still growth, but again, not astronomical, not like what we're about to see, because with this new $100 million of investment, their plans were to open 25 new stores in 2022 and 25 additional new stores in 2023, with plans to expand into new markets. So Austin and Boston were in 2022. And then in 2023, they had plans to expand into New York, Nashville, and Miami.
Yeah, and they also had plans to ramp up their private label portfolio, like production, right, of in-house Foxtrot branded products. That eventually accounted for 30% of their retail offerings and nearly half of all their sales.
This is really interesting. I mean, we just did a news segment on Trader Joe's, right? And we, got some insight into their strategy and how they're able to somehow offer very low price products on their shelf, utilizing in-house, right, private label products, if you will. And this is something that I wasn't aware that Foxtrot was doing until I did the research. And then I remembered seeing like gummy worms that were Foxtrot branded like at some point. So I think this is an interesting move. And in hindsight, I wonder, did it replace any products on the shelf, or was it an added value, you know what I mean? Like added SKUs, like to the product on shelf. It's an interesting piece of the puzzle here.
Definitely. And, as you already kind of alluded to, Sarah, 2022 is when we really start to see this ramp up of growth, right? And acceleration of it. So we talked about the locations, the new locations. We talked about the new markets they wanted to expand into. We talked about the production, but they also, like with that expansion, announced essentially that they were going on a hiring spree, that they wanted to triple the headcount of their tech team specifically.
Yeah. And the areas that they were hiring for were mainly engineering talent, right? So things like optimizing logistics, optimizing store payments and inventory management, and what they refer to in one of the articles as personalization, right? So algorithms, data, gathering about their shoppers to try to serve them a personalized shopping experience. And I believe we have a quote from the founder in regard to this.
Yeah, Lavitola is actually quoted in one of the articles saying, with this new round of funding, we'll continue to accelerate the expansion of our brick and mortar presence, enter new and emerging markets, and double down on new store formats that answer consumer demand for immersive programming and highly curated assortment.
So I want to pause here for a second, Chelsea. There's a couple of things going through my mind. I was on the Food Biz Wiz podcast recently, and Allie and I were talking about, and this is sort of adjacent, right? But we were talking about if you're not selling a lot of product on like off shelf, right? So if you're in retail stores and your product really isn't moving, the answer to your sales problem is not getting your product into more stores, right?
Yeah.
The answer sort of to your problem is figuring out, how do I get my product off the shelf? How do I get consumers to buy my product? Hindsight here is implying that perhaps their stores were not profitable at this point, right? As they're starting to grow. Maybe they were profitable in Chicago. Like, we don't know those details. But again, the hindsight is kind of implying here that there was a lot of growth, but not necessarily profitability in each of these locations. I don't know how you get a store profitable in year one. So if you're losing money in one new location and then you multiply that by 23 in 12 months, that's 23 times the potential losses that you could be having, right? So, and I remember this from my food business, right? We had one store, one location, I should say. We were a pop-up that generated revenue, but it wasn't enough revenue to keep the business going, right? And we had these overhead expenses that we needed to cover. And the logic we were utilizing and that people were telling us about, right? These people that we thought were smarter than we were, open another location, reach another neighborhood. The revenue from that location will help to cover these overhead costs that you have. But the reality was that new location came with a brand new set of costs.
Exactly.
And the profits there weren't high enough to actually contribute to those overhead costs. And what we ended up doing was losing more money. I often say, the costs outpaced the new revenue, right? Or the revenue growth. And so I wanted to stop here for a second and just talk about, like, you have to have a model that works and a model that generates profitability or has a seemingly reasonable amount of time to generate profitability if you're going to open 23 new locations in a year. I would say, or else you need to have a ton of funding. But they did in this case, and that funding wasn't hung on to provide cash for operations when locations weren't profitable. It looks like a lot of it went into the actual opening of these locations and then the hiring of these engineers. Now, this all comes with a disclaimer of, like, I have no idea what their actual books looks like. I'm basing this off of sort of looking back on what happened and the information that we're able to gather. But I think it's a learning point for people. It's a, and for me as a CFO as well, right? So wanted to kind of take a moment to talk through that.
And I also think it's interesting, we've seen many stories of businesses that go into this hyperdrive, right? Acceleration of growth. And almost never is it because they're profitable.
Yeah.
Right? It's almost always because they are chasing a certain level where they believe they will become profitable.
And let's go back to the episode that we did not long ago, Chelsea, where we actually looked at the same business operating at 3 different profit margins, right?
Mm-hmm.
Something we know is that we can model at what point growth will result in profitability. But when you are growing and your expenses, all of them are growing with that revenue, there is no guarantee of profitability, right?
Yeah.
There has to be some, level of consistency. It's typically with your operating expenses, right? Like, okay, our operating expenses are going to hold steady while our revenue grows, and our labor costs might go up. But if they're not going up as a percentage of revenue, then okay, there's still benefit to this growth. So you bring up a really good point that growth is not the answer to profitability. Strategic growth and an understanding of, based on my model, meaning what I'm selling, what my margin is, what my overhead costs are. Do I know how much money it will take me to achieve profitability? And do I have the money needed to invest in my business to get there?
Yeah, but that's not the story that we hear, right? Celebrated. That's not
Right.
the story that we hear in magazines or textbooks around business. And to even drill down on that point, at this point in January of 2022, right, when they are growing this quickly and they are taking in all this funding, at this point they have 25 investors, right? That's 25 people believing in you and what you're doing.
Yeah.
And they had a valuation somewhere between 500 million and $1 billion, according to Privco.
Yeah. I'm not going to get into my thoughts on valuations of companies because that's another topic for another day, but it's fascinating. It's really fascinating to think about, what is deemed good. Some of the articles we read, and there are many that we're not referencing here, but there are conversations, between grocery store veterans and other types of folks in the industry. One of the things that's popping out in my head right now is a gentleman who was a veteran in the industry saying, from the outside, we assumed they were profitable.
Yeah.
Because they were growing like crazy, and because people, I don't know why I'm giving them a Southern accent, but they were growing like crazy, and they were popular, and people were investing in them. And one does believe that, well, things must be going well. They must be going in the right direction. And you said this when we were doing our preparation, Chelsea. You talked about the difference between how people invest in like grocery and food versus how people invest in technology. And it does seem like a lot of the investment here was technology focused.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. And I think that goes back to the original business model, right? What they were originally selling is this app, this delivery service, right? And as you already stated, bringing in or prioritizing tech-driven positions even within the company.
Yeah.
Right? They're really positioning themselves as being a tech-focused food company, retail company.
Yet interestingly, I don't have it in my notes here, but another thing that we read, and I believe this was quoted sort of early on in the life of the business, Lavatola was saying that one of the reasons they moved to brick and mortar was A, because of that restriction around delivering alcohol, but B, people wanted an in-person connection. They wanted to touch and hold and feel the product. They wanted to have a connection with experts in store, right? So there was both this understanding, it seemed like, of this in-person interaction that people wanted, but then also this high investment in technology in order to serve people. And at the risk of jumping ahead, in an article in Modern Retail, they interviewed a number of employees, or a handful, I should say, of employees. And one of the things that seemed a common thought across employees was that Foxtrot maybe didn't have a good sense of who they were as a business, right? They were both a delivery business and this high-end convenient store. Yet when you think about a convenience store, even a high-end one, they had a coffee bar that turned into a wine bar at night, right? They did have that delivery element, but then they also had the in-store element. And so that's another thing that I think is important to sort of pause and think about, is like, how many times have we had a brand strategist on
Yeah.
this show and they talk about like knowing who you are? Katie Melezova says it all the time. Know thyself first,
Yeah.
or first know thyself. I might be getting that wording
Yeah.
wrong, but it's so true. And know your customer.
Yeah. And, quite frankly, I think that becomes even more exaggerated, or like we can really see the impact of that lack of vision
Mm-hmm.
going into the summer of 2022 and beyond, when Foxtrot brought in Liz Williams, who was a former Dry Bar and Taco Bell expansion. It brought her in as president, and her focus was around growing and nationalizing the brand, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then she was promoted to CEO in 2023. And what we saw under her tenure as CEO is that her role really ended up turning to cost cutting as
Yeah.
the economic climate changed, right, in 2023. This is when they stopped working with local and emerging brands, and those were really deprioritized in favor of national brands. But again, as you pointed out, right, with that, who are they? That was a core piece, I feel like, of who they were at the beginning.
Yeah. Yeah.
And now they're letting that go.
Yeah. And I think a piece of that, or one of the reasons for that is financial,
Yeah.
right? You're saying cost cutting. So obviously it's financial, but we can go even deeper and point to March of 2023, when according to Crunchbase, they had another round of financing, but this time, for the first time, it was debt financing to the tune of $30 million. Now, again, we don't talk negatively about debt financing here. That's not something we do, right? It's not an inherently bad thing. But in the context of this story, when we're seeing a lot of, investment funding, equity funding, we're seeing a ton of growth, and then we see a large round of debt funding in conjunction with cost cutting, in retrospect, right? Learning from this history, that you're going to go, uh-oh, this is where things are really starting to not look so great, but right? And to your point, for that to not only be realized internally, but to then be realized on the shelf, where when a customer is coming in, they're no longer seeing the same product on the shelf. Or I think one of the examples was La Colombe was brought in as a coffee brand. They're a very big coffee brand owned by Chobani, I believe. That replaced the local coffee that had previously filled the shelves of the various regions that Foxtrot was in.
Each store, right, in its
Yeah.
own location would use local coffee beans from local roasters in their cafes.
Yeah. So that is a brand strategy, like a breakdown, right? If we're using what we've learned from Katie and others, as I mentioned before, this is community ties. This is supporting your local, small businesses and other founders in your neighborhood. And then that is going away. That is a big shift in who are you as a business.
Yeah. Along with that method of cost cutting, right? They also saw a reduction in labor costs at their stores. This was a big area of focus for them. We don't have this quoted here, but one of the things that we read about was that there were particular stores that were very much unprofitable,
right?
Or where it was very inconsistent, right? Because of the location.
Yeah. For example, being by like Wrigley Field, right? And so if there's not a game, then the foot traffic is much slower than if there is a game.
Yeah. And to compound that makes it even more difficult to like manage your labor costs.
Yeah.
Because from one day to the next, there's no consistency.
Yeah.
And one former employee actually said that they heard of some store managers who were working more than 70-hour weeks in order to keep the labor costs down at their particular location.
I think this is another potential like stopping point and learning point here. Something that is so common is founders working for free for their businesses. Mm-hmm. And I understand that, and I did it too, right? In the beginning. I mean, I did it in my food business. I did it here in my consulting business. there are investments you want to make, there are things you need to do, and that's where you want to use the money. But oftentimes what that does is it gives us an unrealistic view of what it truly costs to run our business. And if your business is, not profitable or struggling financially, and you can't pay yourself, and you don't know when, what I have started calling the tipping point is, where you're going to become profitable, how do you stay committed to the vision? How do you stay committed to the long-term goal? It's why it's so important to me and to my clients, I believe, and to many of our community members, to pay your employees a good living wage, right? A true wage for the work that they're doing, to pay them for all of the hours that they work.
Mm-hmm.
And to also pay ourselves as founders, because it's important to the longevity of the business. It's important to your health and well-being. And it's just, this just is reminding me that it's not a strategy for staying alive as a business.
100%. And we also saw in 2022 and in 2023 multiple rounds of layoffs as well.
We didn't see this in a number, like in several articles that we looked at, but this was information that employees had provided to the authors of an article. And, it's not something I had heard in the media previously. Layoffs are not unheard of, right? If you have an overstaffed store, kind of as you were pointing to, if you've got maybe too many people on the team. This is a common thing I see when brands get a lot of money, like in an investment. We've seen brands get, $2 million, and they fly through that in a couple of months because they hire people, right? It's like, well, it would be great to have a person do this, and we can have an in-house that. And you know what I mean? You really ramp up, and everyone is in a very specialized role, which is amazing and like the ultimate goal.
Yeah.
But if you do that too quickly, or you don't have the profits, right, and the cash flow to sustain that, then it's push is going to come to shove, and you're going to have to lay people off. And so I assume that's what part of what happened here too.
Totally. I imagine, like, okay, I have my $2 million in funding. What's the first role that I want to fill?
Yeah.
Then when I get the return on investment of that role, now we can go to the next role, right? But like you're saying, when you just do it all at once,
it's hard to convince people to be conservative. And something that is like an overarching message and of this episode, right, is like, just because you have the money doesn't mean you should go out and spend it. Like, what would it look like if you had several months of payroll in the bank while you were still, right, generating revenue or like trying to grow your business? What would it look like if you had your next several rounds of production covered, like in the bank? Like, what does it feel like to have a cushion, a cash cushion, and to spend on the things that will have the biggest return on investment right now? You can get a lot of money and still have what we'll call a bootstrapper mentality, right? And I'm not going to say there's nothing wrong with that. I'm going to say that I encourage that.
Yeah. I love that. Now we're getting to November of 2023. And I think this is the part of the story that most of our audience listening is going to be a little more familiar with, right? In November of 2023, Foxtrot announced their merger with Doms.
Yeah. And this is interesting because it is called a merger. And one of the things that we read was that Foxtrot felt that it was advantageous to join with Doms because they would no longer be competing with one another, but they could sort of share in the market. And you pointed this out, that Doms had just 2 locations.
Two at this point, Foxtrot's 33.
And were both of Dom's locations in Chicago?
Yes.
So you also have this very local brand with 2 locations merging with a multi-region brand with 33 locations at the time that they closed. Let's point this out too. There were plans to add 25 stores in 2022 and 25 stores in 2023. At time of closure, they had 33 locations. So they didn't quite make it all the way to their biggest plan, the biggest rollout plan. I don't think they ever made it to Miami, and I don't know that they made it to New York.
And to your point before, where you said that, what they shared about the merger was that it was advantageous in the fact that these two, businesses like shared consumers. But there were people inside the finance team and inside the company that we've seen or we've read kind of off record. They were sharing that it really was either merge with DOMS or file bankruptcy.
Yeah. And this was, again, in November of 2023. And there is something I want to read from Modern Retail. A couple of things, actually. So one is that when they got together for like a corporate, executive meeting, and there was a discussion about the finances, one of the executive finance team members said that Foxtrot was on track to miss its sales goal by about $35 million in 2023.
Yeah.
Reportedly, that was confirmed by two people who attended the meeting. So initially, according to the article, Foxtrot was projected to have about $165 million in sales in 2023. I don't know if that included all of the stores being successfully rolled out. We don't have that information, but it was only on track to bring in about $130 million in revenue that year. So that goes back to what I said before. It's like, if as you launch a store, it takes a year or 6 months or even 3 months to become profitable, which would be wildly wonderful, right? Adding 25 new stores that are all not making money, right? In addition to new team members, like, tripling your technology team headcount, like that's a lot of money going out, both in the growth itself and to fund the business until it reaches profitability. It's a lot. That's a lot of money.
Yeah. And so, you're very clearly painting the picture, Sarah. At this point, at the end of 2023, things are looking bleak.
Yeah.
And nobody knew.
No.
And then in March of 2024, Rob Twyman, who was a grocery veteran that worked for Whole Foods for almost 3 decades, right?
Mm.
He took over the role of CEO from Liz Williams.
He didn't have a long time to create change there. I don't have his exact start date for 2024. We'll say that Liz moved on to El Pollo Loco and became the CEO there. And Mr. Twyman came on at Foxtrot. And then, as we all know, as of April, I believe it was the 23rd of 2024, Foxtrot released a statement on social media that said, quote, "We explored many avenues to continue the business, but found no viable option despite good faith and exhaustive efforts." I don't make any assumptions that anyone associated with Foxtrot or DOMS is okay with how things played out. Like, I don't think that anyone is, proud of it, let's say. Yeah. But I do think that this statement and the information that we have gathered from, the multiple articles and information that we've read, that, all signs point to, we knew about this internally for months and closure was imminent. And it makes the lack of communication to brands and employees even harder to swallow.
Yeah, absolutely.
And if they had been more forthcoming with the information, even to their team members, I shared in the previous episode, in the news, segment there, that brands had brand new products greenlit and approved to go into Foxtrot, multiple SKUs. They were manufactured, they were palletized, and they were shipped at no small cost.
Yeah.
At least halfway across the country, only to find out days later that the stores were closing. And now, and we don't, the freight money is lost, and what is going to happen to our product, and we don't know. Right. And I don't want to spend too much time and sort of dwelling on that, but I think the learning lesson here, if there is one, and this is hard, like this is, as someone who has closed a business, it's difficult because you reach a point where you need to do it, and the rollout is tough, right? Because you need to, I think if I'm remembering correctly from when we closed our business, and you might remember better than me, Chelsea. You were a part of that with us. I think that we gave some notice.
Yeah.
I left before the business officially closed, but I gave notice, I think, that I was leaving. And then I think there was notice that like to our customers and to our team, like, okay, we're going to wrap this up in the next like week or two. You know what I mean?
I think it was at least 2 weeks, if I remember.
And so I share that because I know that it's not easy to make the call to end your business. I know that it's not easy to tell your staff that you employ that is going to have to go find new work somewhere that this is coming to an end. But I'll be damned if it's not better to do it a couple of weeks before it actually happens. So you give these people an opportunity to move on.
And I agree with you wholeheartedly, Sarah. And it's not just that it was like an overnight thing. This literally happened while there were customers in the store. There's been, shared on social media, employees of these stores sharing video of customers in the stores while they're being told to lock up. Yes.
Wow. That's stunning.
It's like, talk about a shock to the system.
Yeah. Yeah.
The only reference I have for that, the only thing I can compare it to is when I was a manager for a retail location and we got a call on March, whatever, 2020. Hey, your store needs to be closed by 4 p.m. today. We're shutting down.
Right.
But that was because of a global pandemic.
Right. Yeah.
So I can't imagine.
Yeah. And I think too, and again, I'm not saying that this is easy, but I imagine behind the scenes, right, that $30 million in debt funding is running low, right? They've got to service that debt. They probably need more debt. And in the financial environment that we're in right now, it's not easy to come across funding, especially if you are not profitable. You're not generating the level of cash flow that you would need to support the additional debt that you want to take on. You can sort of see it coming. And I imagine they, tried everything they could to get the money that they needed. And when they got the final no or ran out of time, that's when it officially ended, And okay, so what is the learning moment here? Because again, this is not about ragging on Foxtrot. This is not about what should they have done or could they have done better. This is about what can we learn from this, right? So at this point, what it takes me to is always, like, first and foremost, know your cash flow, understand your cash flow, right? Pay attention to it on a regular basis. Gain an understanding of what the point of profitability is for your business. And as soon as you can, understand how much money that should take to get there. And if you can get the funding for that, great. And if you can't, be realistic with yourself that you can't. Or if you think you can and things change, like the economy, right? Like, again, just be honest with yourself about like what is possible and how much debt you can afford. And don't rely on debt coming in that you haven't actually secured yet. That's something else that I've seen with some businesses and really of multiple sizes where you think, I'm going to get this 100K. I'm going to get this 500K. And so you act financially as if you have already gotten it, and then you don't, and then you're really in a tough position.
Yeah.
So I think my big takeaway here is, when you see something coming, believe that it's coming, right? And if you don't have money in hand yet, don't count that money like it's yours.
A lot of lessons.
A lot of lessons. And, in reading the news and hearing the news, I think obviously the first thing we go to and the thing we were hearing about most, certainly where we spend our time on social, right, with brands and founders and other retail stores, we want to hear from the brands and the founders and the employees and have empathy for them and what is going on with them. And we want what's right for them. And again, we'll point you guys to, if you're someone who was in Foxtrot, any of the locations, there's resources at Pod Foods and founder resources, founders coming together to create community around this in support of one another. We'll link to those again in these show notes for this episode. And that's been amazing to see. I think when really bad things happen, the bright side is that people do come together and try to make things as right as they can.
Yeah.
But what we didn't want to let go was an examination of what happened here to the best of our ability, digging into the information. We wanted to know from early on, how much funding did they have?
Yeah.
33 stores. What was going on there? Like, what could possibly have gone wrong? And not just to say, wow, they blew it, but to say, how do we not let this happen again? How do we use this platform that we have as the Good Food CFO to help other brands do things differently?
Yeah. And I think exactly what you just said, do things differently, right? Because all of the things, and we mentioned this at the top, all of the things that you're talking about are the things that we traditionally hear celebrated.
Yeah.
Right? And so what can we learn from that? And how can we take a different perspective to have a better outcome?
Yeah. So we're going to wrap this up here. I do want to say that if you enjoyed this episode, if you have a takeaway from this episode, let us know. This is a different kind of episode for us. We felt really passionate about doing it and walking through this story in the way that we did. Send an email to hello@thegoodfoodcfo.com. We'd love to hear from you. If there are other topics, other businesses that you want us to dive into, let us know. We can learn from others. We can learn from history, as we said at the top of the episode. So let us know if there's a brand or something you're interested in sort of learning from, and we'll explore the possibilities of doing an episode on that as well. But for now, we're going to say farewell, and we will see you next week.
Looking for more content like this? Subscribe to our YouTube channel. You'll see weekly podcast episodes as well as other content related to the show. Just visit youtube.com/@thegoodfoodcfo.
Thank you for joining us here today. If you enjoyed this episode or found it helpful or inspiring in any way, please share it with your founder friends on social and rate and review the podcast wherever you listen. It's the #1 way to help good food founders find the show. We'll be back with a brand new episode next week.